We're going to be discussing the impact of environmental and chemical exposure on our brains. My name is Anissa Mitchell. I'm with PMD Alliance, but this is actually one of our programs, part of our Proactive Brain Health Alliance. We started this initiative actually in 24, so it hasn't been around that long. I think summer of 24, in collaboration with CND Life Sciences to help those people who want to take a proactive approach to having a healthy brain, whether they're just generally interested in maintaining their brain health, if they have not been diagnosed with something yet, but maybe at risk because they have a first-degree relative that has a neurodegenerative disease. Maybe they've had genetic testing and they've been identified as having a gene associated. Maybe they have had positive skin biopsy testing done. Maybe they have prodromal symptoms like REM sleep behavior disorder or loss of smell, and they are not sure what this means for them and they want a place to go to get education. We created this space for people that are interested in all of those buckets, to get some education that's targeted on general brain health education, as well as maybe some specific topics that help us to learn about things that we can do, actionable steps to take to help maintain our well-being and our well-being. And we'll be offering these around every other month. In addition to quarterly, we have a program that's called The Space Between. And this is for those who actually are at risk. They are not yet identified as having any diagnosis yet, or they are prodromal. So someone has told you, well, you have what we call prodromal symptoms such as REM sleep behavior disorder or a loss of smell or constipation, one of those or a collection of those symptoms, but you haven't been told that you have an actual like diagnosis of Parkinson's or a Parkinsonism. And so that's kind of an odd place to be for some people. So we created The Space Between as a place where you can come together and ask some questions of an expert, have some opportunity to kind of share your experience with others who are also in that space. And we have that program actually coming up on March 25th. It'll be at 4 p.m. Pacific time. So you can look on the Proactive Brain Health Alliance website, which I see Kelly's dropped in the chat. And you'll find information to register for that program. But today's program is actually really for anybody. And so we're excited to have you all here. This one is being recorded. You will find the recording of this program today on our Proactive Brain Health Alliance website. So you can go back and review it or share it with somebody else that might actually benefit from this information. And one more bit of housekeeping before we kick off. We actually are conducting a survey for those who might not yet be diagnosed with something, that might be concerned that they're at risk or they may have prodromal symptoms. So if you're someone that falls under that category, we're going to drop a link for that survey in the chat. We invite you. It's not a long survey, but we really want to hear from you and get some feedback on to your experience and how you've learned of this and how that's been managed so far. You also may have gotten that link when you got a registration email. I think it's going to come to you in a follow-up just in case. You can also find it on the website. So we'll give you different ways to engage in that, but it really helps us to kind of understand that experience. This is sort of a new space out there for the movement disorders world. And so we kind of want to learn a little bit about that experience. So thank you for helping us with that. And I will also tell you that at the end of today's program, we are going to do a quick 2-question poll. We're going to start doing this to kind of help us understand whether we're meeting some educational needs, that we've given you some information that's helpful to you, that can give you some actionable steps to take. So we'll do that at the end. But I want to introduce our speaker today. Many of you know Dr. Ray Dorsey. He is the David M. Levy Professor of Neurology and Director of the Center for Health and Technology at the University of Rochester. But I think the reason most of you probably know Dr. Dorsey is because he was one of the authors of the book Ending Parkinson's Disease that provides a prescription for ending this debilitating condition. Thank you for putting it up. And let's spotlight him, Kelly, if we can. He actually has a new book coming out this August. We're hoping it's in August, called the Parkinson's Plan. And you can actually pre-order this book. We're going to give you the link to do that as well. We're giving you a lot of links today, so you might want to save that chat. But I'm excited about that because I think this is kind of like the next step from your ending Parkinson's disease. Is this correct, Dr. Dorsey?
Yes, yes. And everyone calls me Ray, and delighted to be with you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Well, I want to kick off a little bit and go back to the Ending Parkinson's Disease book first before we get too far into what's coming next in this new book. But in this book, you talk a lot about the number of people that are being diagnosed with Parkinson's, how that's expected to double. And I want to see if we can talk a little more, because I think it's very related to the topic today, about the principal causes of Parkinson's and related neurodegenerative diseases. And why is this increasing?
Yeah, so thank you very much for all your efforts. Thank you for arranging such a wonderful community, and thank you all for your interest in Parkinson's. You know, a lot of people spend a lot of time and energy trying to treat and improve the lives of people with Parkinson's disease, and that's really, really important. At least as important is trying to prevent the disease. And I hope we focus on how do we prevent people from ever developing these debilitating diseases, and not just Parkinson's, but brain diseases from autism to Alzheimer's. So Parkinson's is the world's fastest growing brain disease, or one of them. Since according to the Global Burden of Disease Study, about 2.6 million people had the disease in 1990, about 6.1 million in 2016, and 11.8 million in 2024. So this doubling even faster than every 20 years is quite concerning, and it's faster than aging would explain by itself. If you thought Parkinson's disease were just merely a function of aging, then you would expect it to rise just in line with aging, but it's rising much faster than aging. And indeed, if you look at the map of the world, if it were aging, you would expect that the rate of Parkinson's disease adjusted for age would be homogeneous, that all parts of the world would have equal prevalence of Parkinson's disease. But that's not the case. Areas of the world that are most industrialized, like Canada and the United States, have 5 times the higher rates of Parkinson's disease than areas of the world that are less industrialized, like countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And even within a country like Canada, you see a near perfect correlation between use of pesticides and the prevalence of Parkinson's disease. And that same study, which was done in 1987, was replicated in France, and I believe in Israel as well. So you see substantial variation between countries that are tied to industrialization, and then you see substantial variation within countries that are tied to different environmental chemicals. So in short, and we've known this for quite some time, that the principal causes of Parkinson's disease aren't genetics. Only about 15% of people have any kind of identifiable genetic risk factor disease. 85% do not. And it's not just due to aging alone. In fact, if you look at the aging curve for Parkinson's disease, the number of people diagnosed with the condition does increase with age, but it looks just like smoking. You know, smoking is really rare in people under 40 because it takes years of smoking and then years for that smoking to lead to cancer. I think it's the same case with Parkinson's disease. It takes some period of time of exposure, maybe years, maybe some cases less, and then years for that exposure to lead to the symptoms being developed, like tremor and slowness of movement. And so we don't think of lung cancer as a disease of aging. I don't think we necessarily need to think of Parkinson's disease as a disease of aging. I think we need to think about lung cancer and Parkinson's disease as diseases caused by environmental chemicals in our food, water, and air, or in our environment more generally.
We had a question. Ray, how do we differentiate between the number of people being diagnosed and the knowledge of the disease?
Yeah, so many of my colleagues say, well, hey, we're just more and more aware of this diagnosis, and therefore we're better at diagnosing, and therefore that's leading to the increase in the disease. And that might be a factor, but if that were a factor, you would expect all diseases to become more prevalent. We're better at diagnosing Alzheimer's disease, and we are much, much, much better at diagnosing multiple sclerosis, and much, much better at diagnosing stroke because we have fancy MRI machines, which have helped us to identify people who previously would have gone undiagnosed. Yet the incidence of Alzheimer's disease is pretty flat. The number of people with stroke is decreasing. The number of people with multiple sclerosis is maybe perhaps decreasing. So at the same time that our ability to diagnose other conditions has unquestionably improved, some of those diseases are becoming less common, and Parkinson's is becoming more common. I also don't think I'm necessarily any better of a clinical neurologist than my peers from a generation or two ago. So I think we should have a little bit of humility.
Let's talk about these chemicals. We're exposed to them pretty much every day, almost constantly. I mean, you hear all the time about microplastics and them being found in our bloodstream, forever chemicals, pesticides, toxic solvents, all of it. Like, I want to dive into some of these things because we're getting questions, already in the chat. Does a certain type of chemical have more effect, like solvents or toluene containing chemicals, about TCE? I know we're going to talk about TCE. So can you talk a little bit about what pesticides are people commonly exposed to, and maybe even the mechanism of exposure?
Yeah, so I only think we'd be Pollyannish about this. I think there are certain chemicals are nerve toxins. They're designed to damage the nerve systems of insects, for example, and pesticides. Not surprisingly, some of these chemicals may cross-react to different species and have dangerous implications for humans, for example. I think there are three major classes of chemicals that we should be concerned about for Parkinson's disease. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think these are the three biggest ones, especially for the United States. One are certain pesticides. The poster child for this might be a pesticide called paraquat, a weed killer commonly used on corn, soybeans, cotton, and vineyards. Dry cleaning chemicals, including this chemical called trichloroethylene, which has a very intimidating name, but a very simple chemical structure. Many of you know that water is made up of three atoms, H2O, two hydrogens, and one oxygen. Trichloroethylene is made up of a whopping six atoms, two carbons in black, one hydrogen in white, and three chlorine atoms in green, hence its name trichloroethylene. It's got a cousin that's called perchloroethylene. Per just is a prefix meaning four. It's got an additional chlorine atom here. Most dry cleaners in the United States are still using perchloroethylene, and trichloroethylene widely used in degreasing, in dry cleaning, degreasing, and even decaffeinating coffee. It's the same chemical that contaminated the marine base Camp Lejeune, and that's why you've heard a lot about that. And then the third class is air pollution, like outdoor air pollution, when you look at the smog in Los Angeles, you're seeing little pieces of dirt and soot suspended in the air. Most of those we cough out or sneeze out, but some are so small that they penetrate the nerve responsible for smell. And like the Trojan horse, they're carrying around not soldiers, but they're carrying around toxic metals. And these toxic metals may cause misfolding of a protein called alpha-synuclein that leads to Parkinson's, or misfolding of a different protein called amyloid, beta amyloid, that leads to Alzheimer's disease. So I think the three major classes of chemicals for Parkinson's are certain pesticides, not all, certain pesticides, these dry cleaning chemicals, and air pollution. And then two things more on that. One, these chemicals all have a similar mechanism. They damage the energy producing parts of cells called the mitochondria. Your brain is only 2% of your body weight, but is 20% of your energy consumption. And so it's a gas guzzling organ, and be a gas guzzling organ, it needs to have lots of engines in it. And inside the engines are these mitochondria, which take sugar and produce energy out of them. So their nerve cells might be especially sensitive to toxins in our environment that damage energy production. And second, these chemicals are either ingested and therefore might cause early constipation, for example, or they're inhaled and might cause early loss of smell. And so we know for Parkinson's disease that the pathology of the disease in most individuals appears to begin in the smell center. And some individuals might begin in the nerve that innervates the gut, called the vagus nerve. So these chemicals, which are inhaled or ingested, actually fit in quite nicely with what are some of the earliest symptoms of the disease and where the earliest pathology of the disease is found when we look under the microscope.
So it's all around us. So one question is, I know you mentioned ingesting, and obviously paraquat is in corn and different things. So does eating organic food help reduce risk?
Yeah, so we don't have great evidence that it does, but I'll tell you in our first book, and what I do is I buy organic wherever possible, and I wash all my produce with water and actually a vegetable wash to decrease my exposure to pesticides. You can imagine doing that study is really difficult. You know, do you randomize people to eat organic and not organic, you know, as a child, then follow them for 50 or 60 or 70 years, and then see who develops Parkinson's disease and who doesn't? But the absence of evidence doesn't mean that's an evidence of absence. It's just some questions just don't lend themselves to doing a randomized controlled trial to do it. They're just not feasible, not ethical, not practical, extremely hard to do. That said, in our book, we quote Dr. Honglei Chen, who's a neurologist and epidemiologist, who said that if at high levels that he would be concerned about the role that ingested pesticides from food might play in Parkinson's disease. If I had the disease, or if I didn't want to get the disease, I would really avoid it. And we'll talk about our second book, which has the Parkinson's 25, and the first recommendation in that 25 is to buy organic produce and to wash your produce.
So we have some more questions. This person said that they worked with TCE. It looks like for a year in 1990, was diagnosed with PD in 2022. Is there any way to detox brains from TCE?
So first, 1990 and 2022, that were those the years?
Yeah, 1990 and then diagnosed in 2022.
So the Camp Lejeune study followed Marines who were exposed to trichloroethylene on average age at age 20, who were exposed to TCE in their drinking water and their bathing water and their cooking water for on average 2 years. So, you know, if you're a Marine, you're by definition, and almost by definition, young, you're almost by definition healthy, and you're not in a Marine base very long. Yet 33 years later, they developed Parkinson's disease at 70% higher rates than Marines who served at a less contaminated base, Camp Pendleton. So this time of 32 years is almost reading directly from the study in terms of the time from exposure to the time of diagnosis. Now, what can you do after the fact? So can you pull these toxins out of the brain or thing like that? There have been one study that looked at trying to remove heavy metals from the brain. We know that people with Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease have higher concentrations of metals in their brain. And I think that's from the air pollution that we talked about. And they took a chelating agent to take the metal out, and they succeeded in taking the metal out. And unfortunately, the people got worse. I think it's a little bit hard to undo the damage that has been done. I think that what we can do is to prevent worsening of the damage that has been done. So if I had been exposed to these toxins, or if I had the disease, I would be especially keen on not being exposed to any more of these toxins. It's kind of like if I were a smoker and I got diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the first thing the doctor tells you to do? Stop smoking. But if a farmer gets diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, or someone working with TCE gets diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, do we tell them to minimize their use of exposure to pesticides or think about what's in their work environment? I think we should do that. There's some evidence, for example, that people with Parkinson's disease who are exposed to high levels of air pollution might have a more progressive course. And by extension, those people with Parkinson's disease who aren't exposed to air pollution might have a less progressive course. So I think there's lots and lots of things that we can do as individuals, whether we're at risk or already have the disease, to either reduce our risk of ever getting the disease or to slow the rate of progression. And some of these things are really hard to prove, but there's lots of evidence to suggest that they might be indeed the right thing to do.
talk a little bit more about TCE. The EPA recently released the risk management rules. Can you talk a bit about what that is for TCE? What does that mean for people?
Yeah, so most people think like TCE. Why is Ray Dorsey and others talking so much about TCE? It's because we've all likely been exposed to TCE and just don't know it. So TCE in the 1970s, 10 million Americans worked with the chemical. So if you worked in printing or painting, or if you were a mechanic, if you worked in the automobile industry, if you worked with jet engines, if you worked on any process that required degreasing of metal, you were likely exposed to TCE. TCE was in typewriter correction fluid. It was used by embalmers. It was in decaffeinated coffee. It was a widely used solvent, still is. In 1970, 500 million pounds, 2 pounds per American, were used. And more recently, I think it's down to 250 million pounds just in the United States. China, which has the fastest increasing rates of Parkinson's, has half the world's market for trichloroethylene. And then you might say, well, fine, I wasn't exposed by work. I wasn't exposed to consumer products. I'd find that hard to believe. But even if that were the case, up to 30% of groundwater in the United States was contaminated with TCE. So you could have been drinking this in your water and never knew about it. We didn't have the Safe Drinking Water Act until about 1972 or 73, which routinely tested municipal water. And so people were, in some communities, were drinking this water unknowingly that's contaminated with TCE. I saw some Yahoo report today talking about chemicals, unsafe chemicals in our water today. And then 1 in 8 Americans get their water from wells, which are often shallow and prone to contamination from agricultural sites like pesticides or industrial chemicals. And then you may say, well, I didn't drink water. I had great cleaning water. I didn't work with the stuff. I didn't have applications. But TCE can evaporate from contaminated water or soil and, like radon, enter people's homes, schools, and workplaces, and people would not even know about it. I don't know if people have been following Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn, but they have found, which was contaminated with trichloroethylene, got into the water. And there are residences in Brooklyn today that have had levels that are 400 times levels that are deemed to be safe. And so half of Superfund sites throughout the United States are contaminated with this chemical. In Monroe County, Rochester, where I live, there are over 100 contaminated sites with trichloroethylene or its cousin, perchloroethylene. The chemical damages energy-producing parts of cells. When laboratory animals are exposed to the chemical, they lose those dopamine-producing nerve cells that are lost in Parkinson's disease. In our book, we make the argument that TCE might be the most important cause of Parkinson's disease in the United States. And few people know about it. I didn't even know about the chemical until about 10 years ago when my colleague, Dr. Caroline Tanner, introduced me to it. But just given its ubiquitous presence in the environment and in our society, I think it might be the most important cause of the disease for people with Parkinson's in the US.
We have a lot of really good questions. So I'm going to try to get to as many of them as possible. This one is interesting because this person said, I'm worried about my adult children. We all swam in the California Delta when they were young. The deltas run off all farms, paraquat soup. Are there any studies being done to find out if such places are safe to swim?
Oh, I don't know. For Parkinson's, right? My world is like, I look at Parkinson's and I look at brain diseases. So I'll tell you a story. So I did a listening tour in 2022, visiting contaminated sites throughout New York City. And I went to a town called Nassau, New York, in the Hudson River Valley. And local lore has it that in the 1960s, kids were swimming in the lake and they were coming out with burns on their skin. And it turned out that upstream from this beautiful idyllic lake in upstate New York, and upstate New York in the summer is like brilliant, was a local businessman had made a contaminated site and would truck in toxic chemicals to be dumped in the site that was above the lake. So they dump in the chemicals here, and these chemicals would then wash down into the lake. The kids are getting skin burns and then high rates of cancer. TCE is known to cause cancer. That's not even debated. were high rates of cancer were happening in the community, they would put pins around for all the people that were developing cancer. And then it turned out that humans weren't the only ones developing cancer. Pets and farm animals in the area were developing cancer. So they put in, I think, yellow pins for humans and blue pins for animals, identifying it. So yeah, I would be concerned. In a recent paper that we just submitted, skin, like the role of skin absorption, so you can absorb chemicals through your skin, and what role they play in Parkinson's or other Parkinsonian disorders like multiple system atrophy or other things, I think is remains to be determined. But unfortunately, when I see a river now in the U.S., I see chemical. And I think that's a really bad thing and bad indictment of our society.
Superfund sites. Can you explain what those are? Because you talked about them in your book, and you mentioned you've been to several places. So help us understand what that means.
Yeah, so in the 1970s, in upstate New York, near Buffalo, near Niagara Falls, was a community of the future that was built in an area called Love Canal. And Love Canal is called Love Canal because it was a canal that was initially built, to connect waterways, but instead of doing that, it ended up being used by a chemical company to dump large amounts of chemicals, including TCE. And in Love Canal, the community started to have these chemicals percolating up through their basements into their backyards. And the 1970s led to mandatory evacuation of parts of that community, initially with women and children, then later whole parts of the community, and led President Jimmy Carter, the late Jimmy Carter, to eventually sign a law that created a Superfund to fund the cleanup of these sites and would hold responsible parties, chemical companies in many cases, sometimes the military, to clean up these sites. And so these Superfund sites are considered basically the most toxic sites that the EPA has identified. There's about 1,200 or 1,400 of them throughout the United States. Over half of them are contaminated with either trichloroethylene or perchloroethylene. In addition to these federal Superfund sites, many states have their own Superfund sites or equivalent designations, and there are far more of those. Lest you think this doesn't apply to you, let me give you some evidence that it may. So I'm a neurologist. I live in suburban Rochester, where lots of doctors and attorneys live, and there are 4 state Superfund sites within 5 or 10 minutes of where I live. 3 current or former dry cleaning sites, 2 current dry cleaning sites, 1 former dry cleaning site, 2 former dry cleaning, 1 current dry cleaning site, and a metal fabrication plant that I was driving by, hundreds of times, never knowing that they were contaminated with it. They're unmarked. There's no way that the public would know. In some cases, people have been informed. In some cases, that information might have happened 10, 15 years ago, and these houses have turned over, and people could be living next to it. They can have the chemical right underneath their home and wouldn't even know about it.
This is obviously concerning many people if you're seeing all the chats in there. So there's several questions around exposure, like if someone was pregnant and they were exposed, what is the risk factor for somebody?
So the best evidence is from Camp Lejeune, because Dr. Caroline Tanner, Dr. Sam Goldman at UC San Francisco have really done an incredible job of trying to identify the risk. So in our new book, so I told you about the Marines and how they got it. In our book, we highlight the story of Brian Grant, the former NBA basketball player who's the founder and a great individual of the Brian Grant Association. I was reading his autobiography one night, and then right toward the end of it, he says, well, when I was a young boy, my father was a Marine at Camp Lejeune, and I lived on the Marine base. And he lived on the Marine base during the period of peak contamination. So Brian Grant's father died of cancer linked to trichloroethylene. His younger brother almost dies, likely from complications of exposure to trichloroethylene. His health miraculously improved after his family moved away from the base. And then Brian Grant, 33 years later, 31 years later, 30 plus years later, develops Parkinson's, likely while still playing in the NBA. So that's a child getting exposed. And then I get lots of emails, and you guys can email me your stories. I'll just put it in the chat, info@endingpd.org. And I love your stories. And then I spoke to a woman who was conceived at Camp Lejeune. Her father, if I got the story right, developed Parkinson's disease, and then she later develops Parkinson's disease herself. And she wasn't even born in Camp Lejeune, she was just conceived. So TCE is this really, really small molecule, so it crosses the placenta. It's found, one study has found this in breast milk. It dissolves in fat. And so, yeah, I get really concerned. I think a relevant exposure can happen in utero. Now, you can imagine doing that study is even more difficult than asking about diet, because, we're not going to go around exposing pregnant women to different chemicals and then follow their offspring for 50, 60, 70 years. But yeah, I worry about in utero exposure a lot. And it's not just this. I'll give you one more example. Virginia Rao is an outstanding scientist at Columbia University. And in New York City, people would spray pesticides to kill cockroaches. And they sprayed a pesticide called chlorpyrifos. And she followed the levels of that pesticide in the umbilical cord blood of children. The higher the level, the lower the IQ at 3, 5, and 7.
That's just horrifying. So we have a lot of really interesting questions. Obviously, a lot of concern around this. This one says, if you have known recent exposure to pesticides, herbicides, airborne by being outdoors next to a field being sprayed with Roundup, can knowing the specific combination of what was applied inform any treatment? Is there any way that there's a connection?
I don't know. So we know there are multiple different causes of Parkinson's. Some people have a pure genetic form. Less than 1% has a pure genetic form, large 2 mutations, 2 to 3%, other things. And these genetic mutations might make people more susceptible to the effects of these chemicals. It's kind of like breast cancer. You can get breast cancer from a mutation, BRCA1, BRCA2, that's only 10%. 90% have nothing to do with it. And then some people it's radiation exposure. Some people it's unexposed, is high levels of exposure to estrogen. And so very different causes can lead to the same disease. Now, whether those diseases could be treated differently, in cancer, yes, we have some evidence. For Parkinson's, really, no one's got a great feel for that. There are some gene-directed therapies that would look at it, but that's hard to say. That's on the treatment front. But let's talk about on the prevention front. So there was work done by Dr. Kimberly Paul and Beata Ritz at UCLA, which showed that you don't have to be a farmer to get exposed to the pesticides. Simply living or working near where paraquat was sprayed doubled your risk of Parkinson's disease. Simply living or working near where pesticides are sprayed, in this case paraquat, doubled your risk of Parkinson's disease. So to me, that's like secondhand smoke. You don't have to be a smoker to develop lung cancer. You can just be the spouse living in the same household, or a person going to bars frequently where people used to smoke, and airplanes where people used to smoke, to be exposed to this. Now, again, not all pesticides cause Parkinson's. It's likely certain ones, the ones that damage these energy-producing parts of cells, and there are other ones there. But yes, and this is all addressable. I mean, do we really need to be spraying high amounts of chemicals on our lawns? Why are our kids' schools being sprayed with pesticides? Why are kids' sports fields being sprayed with pesticides? Can't we save money and improve health by decreasing our use of pesticides? I think the answer to all of that is yes.
This person said, I have Parkinson's and REM sleep disorder. I feel like I'm now allergic to many chemicals. My skin burns, my eyes water when I'm in the vicinity. How do we prevent our communities, meaning HOAs, from using pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers? I've had a letter from my doc with the landscaping people and the board give me notice, then change the dates. I feel like it, even when they're indoors, they're exposed, right? They can still come through. So any suggestions? What can we do?
Yeah, so I'll tell you another story. This is in our book. I think the woman's name is called Miss Sowell, Suwol. And this was in, I don't know, within the last 20 years. She dropped her 5-year-old boy off at Sherman Elementary School in Los Angeles. And her 5-year-old boy was going to kindergarten, and he went outside and then, out of the car, just dropping off the carpool lane. And a man in a hazmat suit was spraying pesticides on his elementary school. Her child had asthma, and the spraying triggered an asthma attack in front of his mom. And he goes, Mommy, is that ever going to happen again? And she said, no. And 2 years later, California becomes the first state in the union to ban the use of certain pesticides on schools, and to require that any school spraying pesticides notifies parents in advance of the use of such pesticides. If California can do that, why can't other states? Why can't we do that with our local community? I live in suburban Rochester, and I went to Henrietta Public Library, like an upper middle class suburb in Rochester, and the town supervisor said, we've stopped using pesticides on golf courses, on schools, on medians. And he said, I haven't signed a invoice for purchasing pesticides yet this year. I don't think any of that stuff's completely out of our control. In our book, we highlight what are things that individuals can do, what are actions that communities can do, and then what are actions that societies can do. So I think there's lots of things we can do as individuals, and I think there are lots of things that we can do in our community to lower our risk of getting Parkinson's disease. And oh, by the way, these nerve toxins, I don't think they're just implicated in Parkinson's. I think they're implicated in intellectual disabilities. I think they're implicated in ALS. I think they're implicated in cancer. So we can all live longer, healthier lives at lower cost if we stop using some of these chemicals.
Speaking of chemicals, there's a couple of other questions I want to ask. This one says, is there evidence of PCB exposure causing PD? I grew up on a lake with PCBs and an EPA cleanup site. My father and I both have PD.
The one, if you can email me, I'd love to learn more about your story. So polychlorinated biphenyls, not taught to me in medical school, maybe I was asleep during that lecture, are also have a chemical similarity to DDT, a pesticide that Rachel Carson wrote about in Silent Spring. And that class of pesticides has been linked to Parkinson's disease. There are a couple studies, and only a couple, that link, that to my knowledge, that link PCBs to Parkinson's disease, but they're concerning. These PCBs are also dissolved in fat. They were widely used in the electronics industry until they were banned. I forgot when they were banned, but they've been banned at least in the US and I think in large parts of the world. And they dissolve in fat. And so they get into water, and then people consume them, and little animals consume them, and then they get magnified or concentrated as they move up the food chain. And so there was a study looking at the Inuit in Greenland and found out that the Inuit who ate large amounts of whale blubber had increased risk of Parkinson's disease compared, I think, to other populations in the North Atlantic. And so high levels of food consumption, to our earlier question about pests, I think our first question about pesticides, was associated with increased risk of Parkinson's disease. And this whale blubber, I think, was high in PCB concentrations. I think PCBs are really, really understudied, as are a number of other chemicals, including trichloroethylene. But I would love to learn more about your story and experience, because this is how I learn, is from people like you sharing your stories. But yeah, I would be concerned.
Chemical mentioned here is malathion. included in the increased risk of PD group?
Yeah, so this is where you guys are going to kill me. So the malathion is a pesticide, and the number of pesticides is like kind of like the number of medications. And so I spent a lot of years in medical school learning all the medications, but I didn't learn all the pesticides. So I don't know if malathion is tied to Parkinson's disease. I'm going to see if I can see really quickly um, what kind of chemical it is. Well, I'm going to look at this while you ask me your next question.
It's come up a couple of different ways today, but basically is around the load of exposure, increasing risk of progression. And this person's asking, once diagnosed, does subsequent exposure increase progression? So I know you mentioned, like, if you're a smoker, quit smoking, you can get it even from secondhand smoke. So that's a great analogy. So is there anything that we can do? Obviously, we can't force them to stop necessarily today, be able to remove the risk. If our HOA keeps doing things, we keep getting exposed in our foods. But is there anything that we can do to help reduce that?
So first of all, you can definitely get your HOA to change it. I mean, who's the HOA is you. I mean, like, and you guys are, many people are parts of PTA, so why can't you change your school's behavior? I mean, what a great gift to your kids and your grandkids is to have them not be exposed to pesticides. And unless we think this is like, pure fantasy, lead levels in children today are 95% lower than when I was a child. Lead levels today in the United States are 95% lower than when I was a child. That means that kids today on the lead front are smarter than when we were kids. And that's because we got rid of lead in gasoline and lead in paint. And lo and behold, we've been just fine in terms of gasoline and just fine in terms of paint, even without with these changes. So I don't think this is any reason that this can't happen. Now, to my knowledge, no one's done the randomized controlled trial taking people with Parkinson's and randomize them to get continued exposure to pesticides or chemicals or not. I did mention that air pollution seems to exacerbate the rate of progression for Parkinson's. I can't help but think that ongoing exposure would worsen the course, and conversely, that lessening the exposure would be favorable for the course. Malathion belongs to a group of pesticides called organophosphates, which are also linked to Parkinson's disease in some studies. The reason I hedge, so you're like, why is Dorsey hedging so much? Is because of every Parkinson's research dollar, only 2 cents goes to preventing the disease. So out of every Parkinson's research dollar, only 2 cents goes to preventing the disease. 60% of research funding in the United States is by pharma and medical device companies who are rightfully trying to develop new treatments for the disease. Most foundations are organized by people with the disease who are trying to find a cure. And so most foundation funding in the United States and around the world goes to trying to pursue a cure. And that only leaves some portion of public funding, usually a very, very modest amount, going to trying to prevent the disease. And so there are homes in Miami and in San Francisco that are sold every year for more money than we spend annually trying to prevent Parkinson's disease. These are reflections of the decisions we're making as societies, and this, quite frankly, as we're doing as community. I mean, you have many donors listening here. If we change the way we invest in disease, and this isn't just Parkinson's disease, if I asked you what causes breast cancer, which is the second leading cause of cancer death for women in the United States, if not, and the most common cause of cancer in the United States for women, I don't think I would get a good answer because, as I told you, BRCA1 and BRCA2 is just 10%. So we're not answering questions about why people get Parkinson's disease, why people are getting Alzheimer's disease, why is cancer increasingly common among people under 50 in the United States. That's before aging would necessarily take effect. It's before cancer screening is largely done in the United States. And while at the same time smoking is going down. If we start answering these questions, I think we find out that chemicals in our food, water, and air are contributing to the rise of a wide range of chronic diseases, and Parkinson's disease is just a poster child for that condition.
I mentioned it earlier when we first started, but I mentioned microplastics. So there was a question. This person said, I recently read in Nature, people with microplastics in the liver and brain have 10 times more dementia. Are microplastics linked to Parkinson's, and how can we limit the microplastic exposure?
So this is new and I'm not well versed, and someone corrected my on the Inuit on the pronunciation. Thank you. So if I make mistakes, please let me know. I'm not well versed, but there was one study in Science, like one of the top science journals, talked about microplastics leading to misfolding of alpha-synuclein. And they're like, if microplastics can do that, then think about what neurotoxins that are being put in there. So to me, if we get concerned about microplastics, which we probably should be concerned about, think about how much more concerned we should be about chemicals like certain pesticides, like dry cleaning chemicals, that we know when we introduce these animal models, they reproduce the features of the disease, that we know that they damage the energy producing parts of cells, that we know that these things have been inhaled and ingested. I just think like we should pay lots of attention. If microplastics are doing this, what are these other chemicals that are likely even more dangerous doing?
So I want to switch gears just a little bit. So we've talked about the problem. There's a lot of problems out there. But how about some action points? What can we do? One is like, what are some great ways that people can proactively go out and talk to, their communities, the government, to make some changes? Are there any one pagers that has like facts and stats that can help people to speak with decision makers?
Well, this is thank you, Anissa, for the question. And since I kept getting these questions, I was like, Michael Oken and I said, we're going to write a book and we're going to give you detailed recommendations on what to do to form a plan. And so in our next book is the Parkinson's 25. I'm giving you a sneak peek. Don't tell my publisher. So here are 25 actions to lower your risk of Parkinson's. For those with the disease, some may even slow progression. Most apply to us regardless of age, sex, disability, or geography. These recommendations may be especially important for those with a family history of the disease, those at genetic risk, or those who've been exposed to toxic chemicals. Let's all live longer, healthier lives and say goodbye to Parkinson's. So as I alluded to, wash your produce, even your organic ones, and we say why. Changing your diet. So many studies have suggested a Mediterranean diet may lower your risk of Parkinson's and may slow the rate of progression of disease. Some of these chemicals like PCBs, like organochlorine, pesticides, concentrate in food as they make it up the food chain. A Mediterranean diet is high in fruits and vegetables, but low in animal products. So it could be less exposure to these toxins as they move up the food chain, might be one of the explanations for why a Mediterranean diet is helpful. Making sure your grocery store is safe. So it turns out that in Germany, that grocery stores that were located next to dry cleaners, when they looked at the butter and the cheese in the German grocery store supermarkets, they find high levels of TCE and PCE in the butter and in the cheese. So now in Germany, you can't build a grocery store next to a dry cleaner. So we should just be thinking about that. And then, enjoying your wine without pesticides. So in the book, which you can pre-order, and the more pre-orders we get, the more attention we get to this topic. And again, it's pdplan.org, and you can pre-order. You can pre-order on Amazon. You can pre-order on Indie Books, I think, right now. And this just builds awareness and of the book and awareness of our efforts to try to prevent and end the disease. And then in the book, we outline what are things we can do as a society. Why can't we change the behaviors of our golf courses? If you're a member of your golf course country club, why don't we ask, what chemicals are we using? What pesticides are we spraying? Could we reduce our use of pesticides by 50%? Could we spray only on certain days and make sure that people aren't using the golf course, on that day or that afternoon or whatever it is? Could we use less toxic pesticides? Could we do the same thing for schools, for sports fields? So, I think there are tons and tons and tons of things that we can do. And our book outlines 25 individual actions, 20 other actions, I think 4 additional actions you can do in your community to reduce it, and 20 actions we can do as a society to change the course of the disease.
Well, you referenced Germany. So there's other countries that are not using these same chemicals and they're still producing food. So are there things that we can learn from other countries that might be helpful as we try to make these changes here?
Yeah, so I told you that Parkinson's is one of the world's fastest growing brain disease. It turns out there are a couple European nations where the rates of Parkinson's might be not rising, but declining. And so there's a recent study in Germany suggesting that adjusted for age, the incidence or number of new cases of Parkinson's might be decreasing. There's a study from the Netherlands that suggested in a span of like only 10 or 20 years that the incidence, number of new cases of Parkinson's disease fell by 60%. 60%. What a gift. And so it turns out that when I looked at that study in the Netherlands, authors didn't know why they had observed this finding. They just reported the finding. They didn't have a great explanation. I went back and it turned out that the use of pesticides or the amount of pesticides in people's fat, DDT, and those other pesticides are soluble in fat. They're fat loving. And you can measure them in the fat, and they had fallen by 75 and 90% in the decades preceding this decline in the incidence of Parkinson's. I looked back at TCE, and the levels of TCE in the Netherlands were among the lowest in all of Europe in 1981. And levels of air pollution, really one of the great public health achievements, have dropped between 50 and 90% in most of Europe and in the United States until these Canadian wildfires and the LA fire. So if you decrease your exposure, decrease the amount of these chemicals in your environment, certain pesticides, TCE, and air pollution, you can see changes. You might see these changes in a relatively short period of time. It may not require 50 years. It may not require 25 years. And again, smoking gives us a hint. Within, think, seconds of smoking your last cigarette, your carbon monoxide levels decrease. Within minutes, your heart rate decreases. Within months, your shortness of breath decreases. Within years, your risk of heart attack decreases. Within a decade, your risk of lung cancer decreases. So even if you've been exposed to these chemicals in the past, stopping or reducing your ongoing exposure may change the course of this disease. Very few studies, if none that immediately spring to my mind, have looked at this in Parkinson's, but we have really, really good evidence for lung cancer that this is the case. And I think it makes a lot of sense that this would also be the case for other diseases, chronic diseases tied to chemical exposure.
Well, thank you. Because hearing all this, we definitely at least want some action steps to be able to take. So I know everyone is looking forward to the release of this book and getting some of these key points. So thank you for sharing that. I will give everyone, a last few minutes if you have any additional questions for Dr. Dorsey. And in the meantime, I shared with you that we are going to have a 2-question poll. If you please just take a moment. While they're pulling that up, Dr. Dorsey, I am going to say there's a couple more questions. So this one's a really good question. I think there was more than one person who asked this. They wanted to know, why does siblings and California get PD, but not the other siblings? I guess if somebody is given the same environment and they're exposed to it in a sibling group, is what they're asking, why does one sibling maybe get the disease and the other sibling does not?
So the short answer, we're not sure. So most people exposed to a chemical do not develop the disease. So only 10% of smokers get lung cancer. So 90% of smokers don't get lung cancer. So it doesn't mean that smoking doesn't cause lung cancer. It just means that you need, some individuals, you either need more smoking, and we don't want to do any of that, or other factors that contribute to it. So I think there are a few things to consider. One is the dose of the exposure. How much were you exposed to, for how long, by what route, and I think when. And I think the earlier, the worse. So you can imagine perhaps the older sibling might have been exposed, and then the younger sibling less exposed, or conversely, it could be the opposite. The family moved to a new environment, and therefore some people were. I think there are interactions. I think there are interactions with the environment. So we know that many farmers, for example, are exposed to many different pesticides, and there's some research suggesting that exposure to multiple toxins can amplify your risk. There are also exposures to these genetic factors. About 15% have these genetic risk factors for the disease or genetic causes. There are also likely some genes that are responsible for the metabolizing or breakdown of these chemicals. So many of you know certain people break down medicines differently than other individuals, and there are likely differences in how people break down these chemicals that could play a role. I think there's also an element of chance. And then finally, there are modifiers. So I think things like stress and diet and exercise and aging, or other comorbidities, other diseases like diabetes. I think all of these things play a role. So what was the dose? What was the overall level of exposure? What are the interactions, and what are the modifiers for the disease? And to the extent twins share either half or, in case of identical twins, essentially their entire genome. But it turns out, study done by Caroline Tanner 25 years ago at UC San Francisco showed that identical twins were essentially no more likely to share the diagnosis of Parkinson's than fraternal twins, the non-identical twins, suggesting that Parkinson's wasn't primarily driven by genetic factors. If it were genetic factors, then identical twins would be very, very, very likely to share same disease as opposed to fraternal twins, but likely chiefly environmental factors that were driving the causes of Parkinson's disease.
Well, do air filters help? So if somebody puts in a really good air filter in their HVAC, is that going to help?
Yeah, so that's one of the top 25 recommendations. If I live in a polluted area, I would do that. My parents live in Southern California, and they have air purifiers. And then we even talk about what to do in traffic in terms of rolling up your windows and recirculating your air. There are lots of things that we can do as individuals, and that's what the Parkinson's 25 is all about, to reduce our risk, reduce our exposure to these chemicals and likely our risk of Parkinson's or our risk of Parkinson's progression, or to slow the rate of progression. And I think there are lots of these things are within our control. That said, our society is, fundamentally dictated by societal decisions. We don't want to be like China, where the wealthy build domes over their kids' soccer fields so their kids can play soccer outside without being exposed to air pollution.
Absolutely. Well, real quick, we're going to ask everyone if you would please answer these 2 questions of the poll from today's program. I just want to say thanks, Ray. I'm going to say this formally in a minute, but you've given us so much good information, and I know everyone's looking forward to your book, and I appreciate you and Dr. Oken taking upon yourselves to give us this information to write this book.
Yes, thank you. And let me know if I didn't answer your question, info@endingpd.org. If you can't afford a copy of our current book, endingpd.org, just email us at info@endingpd.org with your mailing address, and we'll send you a copy for free. We're trying to make this as accessible to people as possible. I can't send you a copy of the new book because I don't have a copy of the new book. Amy Lindberg, who's listening, will get a signed copy of the new book when it comes out because her story's featured in the book. But we want to make this as widely available as possible.
Awesome. And I'll give you just a few more seconds if you haven't had a chance to finish the poll so we can get as many responses as possible. But in the meantime, again, if the links, we dropped a bunch of links in the chat. If you want to save your chat, then you'll be able to go back and refer to them. There's for the book, there's for the other book, there's all of the Proactive Brain Health Alliance links, as well as the survey. We hope that if you fall under that category of not yet diagnosed, but either at risk or having some prodromal symptoms, that you would consider giving some of your information. So I'm going to go ahead and close out this poll, and I want to thank you so much, Dr. Dorsey. This has been really insightful. It's been very helpful, a little scary, but I appreciate your candor about this, and we all look forward to those 25 things we can do to reduce our risk.
Thank you very much, Nissa. Thank you, the PMD Alliance. In our first book, we really argued that the way the course of these diseases change and has changed, whether that's polio or drinking and driving or HIV, is when people who are most directly affected by the disease, who know its profound effect on not only themselves, but their loved ones, make their voices heard. And the HIV activists ACT UP had this great motto of silence equals death. I think for Parkinson's, silence equals suffering. And I think a lot of that suffering is needless. And I think it's preventable. And I'd love nothing more than for our generation to be the last generation that deals with Parkinson's disease, and that future generations only read about Parkinson's disease in medical textbooks or history books, just like we do largely with polio and typhus and many other diseases.
Thank you so much. I know everyone is grateful. If you guys, since we're not going to clap, we could do the wave of gratitude to Dr. Ray for taking his time to do this. Thank you so much, Dr. Dorsey. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Order that book and let's get active. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.